Hey everybody, welcome to the very first installment ever of Historical Interpretation Book Club. So I am really excited to go through this series with you. I hope you're interested in historical interpretation. This is definitely not something that is reserved for history professionals, but it occurred to me that somebody who's not in the field might not necessarily know where to look for some resources about how we do what we do. And while there's certainly plenty of good education to be had in the academic system, this isn't meant to be gatekept. It's for anyone and everyone who's interested. So with that, I thought that maybe folks would be interested in one of my favorite books, this one right here, Interpreting Our Heritage by Freeman Tilden. What's really interesting about this book is that it was written in 1957, and it is super applicable to today. But it's not 100% applicable. So one of the things that is really important for me to strive to do in this study of this book is to make sure that we identify some of the places where this book is actually problematic, because even though the concepts here are still very relatable and really usable, we should be careful of the pitfalls of 1950s scholarship, and we should be mindful of what we need to change in our reading and comprehension of this book to make sure that it is applicable for the 21st century and beyond. So I didn't want to do anything with the introduction. Hopefully, if you have your download or your book, you can read about Freeman Tilden and his life in the national parks and going around. I love my 50th anniversary edition cover because I'm pretty sure that's Valley Forge on the cover. And I dug at Valley Forge for my dissertation project, so Valley Forge will always have a very special place in my heart, and I think it is a quintessential spot for interpretation. But in this video, which I do not want to take terribly long about, I just wanted to start in chapter 1, and it's where Tilden introduces his principles of interpretation. And I wanted to go through and talk a little bit about what he discusses in the first chapter. What I'm hoping will happen here is that you drop into the comments and that we can have a conversation. If you've got questions, if you've got ideas and opinions that you want to share in the comments, and if you see something problematic that either I don't see or that I don't touch on if I'm trying to make a different point somewhere else, or if I completely miss it. So if you see something that you feel is problematic or an issue, call it out. Let's see if there's anything redeemable in it, anything that we can use and change to make it usable, or whether there's a concept or an idea that we need to throw out because it just doesn't work anymore in the 21st century. And then if it's desirable, if everybody wants, then perhaps early next week I can hop on a live at some point and address some of those comments, and y'all can jump in with me. Or we can just head on to the next chapter if the comment discussion is sufficient for all of you. And then next week, or maybe the week after, I will make a video for chapter 2. So this is a work in progress. If this doesn't work out the way that I envision it, let's change the process. So definitely give me feedback. Tell me what works for you and what doesn't, and we'll learn together. So, all right. So Tilden, in his first chapter, gives a quote in the beginning from Imaginary Conversations. And my favorite line out of it is this one: "Nations in a state of decay lose their idiom." And then a little bit later he says, "Speaking to the people, I use the people's language." And for me, that's really, that's kind of the crux of the matter. Most of what cultural institutions present today is kind of dry. It's very academic. And people don't all speak the same language. So historians who speak in historical jargon or academic language aren't necessarily conveying their ideas to a general audience that may care about history, but doesn't speak in the same language as somebody who's a professional historian. And I think it's really important that interpretation is speaking to people using the people's language. Now, this isn't to say that people are stupid or they need anything dumbed down for them. It's making sure to meet people where they are. We all come with different life experiences, we all come with different worldviews, and so it's important that as historians, even if this is something that fires us up, we're passionate about and keeps us awake at night in all the best ways, that doesn't mean that it necessarily translates to someone else. And that's the goal of interpretation, to make this thing that we care about so much relatable to someone else. That's basically the crux of the whole chapter. I could stop the video there, but I'm not going to. So, there are people who perhaps care about history but don't speak the same language, and then there are people that don't speak the history language at all. They don't trade in that currency. That's not the piece of culture that's important to them. But there's still something that can be valued in history by people who don't trade in historical currency. So if what's important to you is something completely different, it's our job as historians and interpreters to bring relevance to that particular worldview that you have and show you where in history you can find something to invest in, to care about, and to find interest in and entertainment in. So if we want to impact people, no matter what they value, then we have to try and speak as many other people's languages as we can. So Tilden says thousands of naturalists, historians, archaeologists, and other specialists are engaged in the work of revealing to such visitors as desire the service something of the beauty and wonder, the inspiration and spiritual meaning that lie behind what the visitor can with his senses perceive. This function of the custodians of our treasures is called interpretation. And Tilden only gets more poetic. You can tell that he really cares about this subject, that it is a passion for him, it's a project for him, and it's not a pursuit of rationality, it's a pursuit of passion and love. And that's really important. He also noticeably in this chapter uses the word performance a lot for interpretation. And I would argue that this will ultimately come down to what I quoted in a few posts ago on my Instagram, which is that the story is the thing. And if you keep seeing me look down, it's because I've got notes on this chapter. I really did write an outline for you guys. The story is the thing. So like it or not, interpretation in the particular form that I'm talking about, historical interpretation, living history, it is storytelling as a performance. And that shouldn't scare anybody. If you're not an actor, that's okay. If that makes you nervous, don't let it. Tilden will guide you through, and I'll be there to translate, I hope. But storytelling is the crux of the matter, and interpretation involves more than just information, as we'll see in a little bit. So good interpretation demands facts, Tilden says. It demands facts. You must have information in your interpretation. And it requires research. But those are not the end goals. That's not the be-all, end-all. Good interpretation is a performance of this fact and information. It becomes, dare I say it, edutainment. It's okay to be entertained by a subject that you enjoy. You're still learning, and that's what's important. So the other thing is, research evolves. Our research should continue. We should always be researching and looking up new information, and we should always be updating our interpretation to reflect the new information that we find. So our performances as interpreters should also continue to evolve, just like our research does. So shortly into the chapter, here on page 27, in fact, Tilden gives a really interesting example of what he considers to be good research that leads into interpretation. And he writes, Colonial Williamsburg, Williamsburg. Colonial Williamsburg itself offers an ideal example of this truth, that there's no substitute for research. He says, here it is possible, through the generosity of Mr. Rockefeller, to employ the skill and taste of the most competent researchers in many fields to the end of bringing to life accurately and beautifully a segment of our American history. Wow, that's very lovely and very idealistic. But this is the first point at which I think that we run into some problematic language and some problematic ideas from Tilden. Again, he is a educated white man in 1957. So I think it's true that Colonial Williamsburg does amazing research. They were doing it back then. But where's the problem come in? Have you spotted it yet? The problem comes in when we realize that at that time, Colonial Williamsburg was, back then, just as they are now, determining what's important. What are we researching? Well, in the 1950s, I can guarantee you that at Williamsburg, there was no specific centering of voices of color, of Native American narratives, of enslaved or free Black narratives. So it's true that Colonial Williamsburg has always been a leader in researching and then translating that research into incredible interpretation, but their priorities have shifted because now, of course, there's lots of focus on voices of color. There's lots of focus on enslaved and free Blacks and Native Americans in the area as the same nation builders as the quote-unquote founding fathers who they once only focused upon. And their representation of women has improved as well. So as we're going through here, that's a very nice example, but it must be taken in the context of its time. In 1957, he probably wrote that thinking about those quote-unquote founding fathers and how important they were for our American history story. It needs to be broader than that. So as we consider what is proper research, does that look like only books that are written by colonizers and people of colonizer descent? Or does that look like oral histories from native cultures and from descendant cultures of former enslaved people? It's not just the written word, and it's not just the majority perception of the underrepresented culture. So we shouldn't only research Native American culture through the eyes of the Europeans who they were encountering and then who were writing about them. We have to look to native cultures to tell us about themselves. I'm fairly certain that that would have been a pretty foreign concept in 1957. So again, we take his principles, Tilden, and we apply them in the modern day, and we make sure to expand our understanding of what is important to research and to include in our interpretation, and what is proper research in the first place. And by the way, it can start with Wikipedia, but it better not end there. Wikipedia is a great place to begin. It'll give you lots of resources and you can dive down the rabbit hole, but please dive down the rabbit hole. Don't stop at Wiki. Okay. So, again, just like research should be re-examined, so should our priorities. The facts that we're putting forward at any given time, right? What are the most important ones? Who are we centering? What's the narrative we're telling? And that will affect our performance and our interpretation. Remember, all of this is so that we can be relevant and relatable to an audience. And our audience are not empty vessels. People come with their own worldviews, their own life experiences, their own perceptions and biases. But the same axiom holds true. People can't be what they can't see. And so, people can't relate to a past that doesn't include them or doesn't include their ancestors. All of those folks were there. We need to make sure to include them. Place matters also. If you're lucky enough to be interpreting in a physical landscape that has historical significance, that is really important. It gives your audience, it gives people who are watching and listening to you a sense of groundedness, a spatial reality. History didn't just happen somewhere abstract. History happened right here where we're standing. And that's fantastic. So if you have the good opportunity to be on a historical landscape while you're educating and interpreting, that's really something you should use to your advantage. People like tangible space to occupy, just like they like to touch and see objects, right? Either reproduced or original. For some reason, we're tangible creatures, and holding something or standing in a place really makes us connect to the people who were there or who used that thing before. That's also why it's really important that we're careful with our historical landscapes and that we protect them and that we protect what activities are done on them. That's why it's important that this interpretive effort be really carefully considered. It's why places like plantations shouldn't ever just be backdrops for a photo shoot. So, there's another quote in Tilden here that I wanted to read to you. He wanted to define interpretation for dictionary sources, which I think is an interesting endeavor, and you all can discuss how you think that he did. I've never been one much for dictionary definitions, but I think this one is pretty good if you had to summarize it in a sentence, one long compound sentence. So he says that interpretation is an educational activity which aims to reveal meanings and relationships through the use of original objects, by first-hand experience, and by illustrative media, rather than simply communicating factual information. So what are your opinions on that? Please drop them in the comments. Tell me about you're responding to my question about the dictionary definition, as Tilden gives it, of interpretation. Let me know if you agree or disagree in whole or in part. For me, the important part there is the tail end, where it's like we use all these tools to do something more than pass off factual information. So whether you're able to be on an actually historic landscape, whether you're able to actually hold historic materials, illustrative media is important. That's anything from a lecture to reproduction clothing or objects to performing dances or concerts and tea parties. I mean, there's all sorts of things that count as illustrative media. And of course, in 2021, this video, digital, is an illustrative media, which is lovely. So regardless of tools, though, for me, the point of that definition is that these are the tools we use to do something more than list fact. And that's really important. While we, if we don't have the luxury of all those resources, there's still an opportunity to do more than recite fact. And then he goes on to talk about definitions for the interpreter. And by the way, here's another place where his simple written language is problematic in 2021. He says, I offer two brief concepts of interpretation, one for his private contemplation and the other for his contact with the public. First, for himself, Interpretation is the revelation of a larger truth that lies behind any statement of fact. So the problematic language I'm talking about here is the use of he, him, his for the general of humankind, which in the 50s that was grammatically proper because of, the ruling class of sort of white patriarchy. So he, him, his. What I would encourage you to do when you see things like this in the text is simply replace it with they, them, theirs. So I offer two brief concepts of interpretation for the interpreter, one for their private contemplation and the other for their contact with the public. Easy. These are things that we should definitely get in the habit of changing in our own minds and then in our performance, our interpretation immediately. Make it second nature because it should be. Things have changed. What was grammatically correct in the 50s is no longer. So please use they, them, theirs as frequently as you can. Get it in here. So first, for themselves, interpretation is the revelation of a larger truth that lies behind any statement of fact. So here we see the fleshing out of this concept, that the fact becomes the tool. The fact is another illustrative media. So how do we use facts and the resources at hand to reveal a larger truth, to make a human connection, to create meaning for someone, and to be relatable to them with all of the life experience that they bring to the table? And the other concept sounds a little akin to edutainment. Listen to this. The other is more correctly described as an admonition, perhaps. Interpretation should capitalize mere curiosity for the enrichment of the human mind and spirit. That's really important. It's not a bad thing. It doesn't devalue your facts if you engage somebody's mind and their imagination. If you can capture somebody's imagination, someone's passion, someone's thought, and through those channels, teach them some factual information, that's perfect. But the goal of interpretation isn't even that. Adding the factual information is important, but creating that human connection, revealing some larger truth, or I might even say it this way, discovering together, interpreter and audience, some larger truth. Because again, our audience does bring their own experience into the interpretive space with you. They are not empty vessels. And so, what can we discover together that is a larger human truth? Using illustrative media, using our resources and our place, and using our historical fact, our factual information. So, Tilden tries to distill this into 6 principles, and I'm told by my friend who works at Independence National Park in Philadelphia that once upon a time she had to have these memorized. Sorry. I don't think I'll ever be able to memorize them because they are multiple sentences each. However, I have tried to sort of encapsulate them here for you. So the first principle, and obviously if you all have this text or you're going to get it, you can read the exact words that Tilden uses. I have paraphrased them because that's who I am. The first one says that interpretation that doesn't relate the content that you're talking about, this factual information, to the visitor or to the audience and their own worldview, then your interpretation is sterile. If you don't connect to people in their own worldview, your interpretation is sterile. Now it is just the recitation of fact and information. That's what history used to be. That's what you can still experience at a number of museums and historical sites for sure. History professionals in that academic, that ivory tower, used to be of the attitude that we are the keepers of knowledge, which is very gatekeepy. We have the education and we have this factual information. And if you would like to have it too, then you can come to our institution and you can sit at the foot of the teacher and you can passively absorb the factual information. That's great, but that only impacts people who love that factual information so much that they eat it right up. And those people exist. They're just not the majority, right? More people come because they want to make a connection with each other, with people in the past, with their own ancestors, with somebody part of a group that they consider an other. They're trying to understand something. And it's not just information that they're trying to understand. So currently, best practices in cultural institutions, museums, and historic sites in particular, is that we understand that our audience, our visitors, come not as empty vessels, but with full worldviews, life experiences, and a whole bunch of baggage, for a better word, and that's not negative. We just all come with our own stuff. There's no such thing as subjectivity. There is none. Objectivity. There's no such thing as objectivity. Everything is subjective because we all come with our own internal biases. So it's our job as interpreters to try and figure out, generally speaking, where everybody's coming from and how we can best relate to them. Obviously, we can't know the details of everybody's lives that we ever encounter, but we can do our best, maybe even through talking with people and asking them questions about where they're from and why they're here, to get to some point where we can relate to them and we can relate the past to them in a way that they not only understand, but that they connect with and find and derive meaning from. And that also means that the more broadly that your interpretation, your interpretive topics reach, the more likely you are to reach more people. So if something that you're really super passionate about is this one particular teeny tiny minuscule detail of history, that is really, really, really cool. Please just understand that it's kind of unlikely that you're gonna be able to relate that to a large audience unless you discover a larger theme within which that fits and you can broadcast the larger theme to a broad audience. All right, principle number 2, information is not interpretation. However, it is required for all interpretation. That's pretty self-explanatory. I don't want to dwell on this one. I just want to reiterate that in 2021, it's important to remember that the question is, what information? What information are you researching? What information are you centering? Who are you privileging in your research, your fact-finding, and then your interpretation? You need to make sure about who it is or what it is that you're looking into, and make sure that your performance relates to and reaches a broad audience, which generally means that you're probably going to have to expand your interpretive view beyond the topics that have already been covered ad nauseum. I only want to hear about another historical president if I can hear about other things about him and other people in his world and other places that were impacted. Okay. Number 3, really important. Interpretation is an art. That's how I would paraphrase that one. Interpretation is an art, and it can absolutely be flexed to your strengths. That's why you shouldn't be scared when Tilden says interpretation is a performance, because it is. But if you play to your own strengths in that performance, then it shouldn't matter if you're not an actor classically trained. I'm not. But it is possible. And then it's easy to evolve your interpretation. You own it. When you play to your own strengths, then you own that interpretation, you own that performance. And then as your research improves and as your practice of your art improves, then so too your performance evolves. And that's a lovely thing. The other thing that he says is that because it's an art, it's teachable. And I believe that. I don't think that you have to have some sort of X factor to be able to effectively interpret. This is teachable. This is one of the books that will do it for you. So really look at these resources for crafting something wonderful and artistic for yourself. And then number 4 principle, this is probably my favorite one of all of them. The chief aim of interpretation is not instruction, but provocation. So again, the main difference between a classroom setting and an informal educational setting like an interpretive environment is that the information and the facts that an interpreter is offering are not the end goal. They're not the be-all end-all. They're not the reason that the interpreter is performing. They are the tools the interpreter is using in order to reach some bigger truth, some deeper connection, to derive some meaning. So I want to provoke. What are we provoking? So I'll tell you some of the things that I want to provoke, and then pop in the comments and tell me some of the things that you're hoping to provoke through your interpretation. Or if you already do interpretation, what are some of the things that you like to provoke and that you have found have given you the best results? So I like to provoke questions. I want people to ask me more. I want to say something that is intriguing enough that somebody comes up with a new question that they want answered, more information that they want to connect with. I want to provoke empathy and understanding. Empathy is essential. It's essential for your interpretive efforts, and it is something that is so sorely lacking in society in general today. So if there's a way that we can get somebody to perceive something that they once considered as other from themselves and to try to understand that differing perspective, then we've done our jobs. Provoking empathy and understanding are really important for interpretation, probably the most important. And I want to provoke thought. I want people to say, oh, I never thought about it that way before, because that leads to those other things. Understanding, empathy, more questions. If I give you a new perspective that you've never seen through the eyes of before, then you're going to be inclined to ask more questions, to think more critically, and to empathize more fully with someone else. Principle 5, interpretation should aim to present a whole rather than a part or a phase. So again, there's some problematic language here. He says a whole man. Let's change that to a whole person. We want to consider whole people, all of their flaws, all of their complexities. Again, I never want to hear about another Declaration of Independence signer as only that. He was probably also a planter or a merchant. He was almost definitely an enslaver. And if he wasn't directly an enslaver, then he still benefited from that institution. So I don't want to belabor that point. I have a whole page written here, but really this one is very simple. Do as much research as you can to talk about and present as complete a person or a group of people as you can. And more information should always be forthcoming. We don't know everything and we can't know everything about what happened. Not and must not deliberately eliminate pieces of people to promote a particular agenda. We need to be inclusive of everything. And finally, interpretation for children does not need to be watered down. It requires a separate approach. Now, I'm going to get more into that at a later date because that's absolutely true. Listen, kids are smart and they are little sponges and they absorb everything. And you can look at educational and pedagogical charts that talk about brain development and when kids learn about concrete concepts and then more abstract concepts and then comparison concepts. And each gaining of a concept knowledge builds on the last one. So all of that to say that kids aren't stupid and they don't need information watered down for them. People saying that kids need information watered down may not understand how childhood brain development works. I don't even know that much about it. I have lots of resources that I'm consulting as I'm building education programs. But let's not be lazy. Let's not use this as an excuse. Children deserve the truth. They deserve the truth gently, certainly, but they deserve the complete truth. And it's something that a lot of kids, especially kids of the global majority, folks who are generally underrepresented in history, are getting at home from parents and relatives anyways. There's a lot of education that goes on in all of our homes with all of our children, and truth is being told. So it's our job to continue to tell the truth and not to water it down. Now, Tilden suggests that we have to take a whole separate approach to children's interpretation, and I think that's probably right, because we need to take into consideration where brain development is for kids of whatever age we're going to talk to as we develop our interpretive performances. But that doesn't mean water it down. That means that kids deserve their own consideration and their own real work to create something for them. And we should do that. There's no question about it. The principles remain the same, especially for kids. If it isn't relatable, then the interpretation is sterile, it's empty. So we just have to do the work to figure out how to make the truth, the information, relatable to kids who have a different worldview and probably a much smaller range of life experience because they've had fewer years of life so far. So that's what we have to do. All right, this has been quite a longer video than I expected to make, so if you are still with me 36 minutes later, I thank you so much. I hope that you have found this really interesting and informative, and I am really hoping that we've got a great conversation going on down there in the comments. I can't wait to see it. And the last thing I want to say is that Tilden concludes just as poetically as he begins, and it's the thing that really encapsulates how I feel about interpretation, interpretive performance, and using interpretation to get to these deeper meanings, because it's not just about the facts. The facts are the tools. He says that interpretation is art. Art comes from love. Again, I'm paraphrasing. And love is the passion that drives us to do this. He's got a whole chapter on love and why we love to do what we do. So stick around, and I hope to see you for the next installment. Thanks so much. Can't wait to read along with you. We'll see you at the next one. Bye.